movement known as spirituality began to really take hold in the mid-1800s. The belief that people could communicate with the afterlife was a relatively new theology that would echo through history into the modern day. At the center of this movement were two young girls who were believed to possess the ability to communicate with the dead. They could receive messages through the ritual use of seance that would lead to the two becoming rising stars within the spiritualist movement. However, much like the story of Icarus, they would eventually turn on the movement they would help to build. The story of the Fox sisters Maggie and Kate is coming up in today's chapter. Stay with us. Hello everyone, I'm Nick, and you've tuned in to a new chapter of the Insidious Agenda podcast. On this week's episode, we're going to explore the events surrounding the Fox sisters in the mid-1800s and the contributions they made to the movement of spiritualism. Ensure you're subscribed to this podcast so you don't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. Now, it's time to turn out your lights, close your eyes, let things go quiet, and just listen. Maybe you're alone. Maybe you're not. Now, follow the sound of my voice, and let's get into our story. Our story begins in the year 1848 in the town of Hydesville, New York. In modern day, the town of Hydesville no longer exists, but was originally a small hamlet in the town of Arcadia in Wayne County of New York State, and today would be considered near the modern city of Newark, New Jersey. Throughout the 1930s, John and Margaret Fox lived in an area of New York known as the Burned-Over District. This was a part of the state that stretched from the center to the western border, most commonly recognized as existing between the Finger Lakes and Lake Erie. It got its name from the event known as the Second Great Awakening, which was a Protestant religious revival movement and the hotbed of religious activity which burned in that area. John and Margaret gave birth to their oldest daughter, Anna Leah, in the early 1800s, followed by 3 more children over the course of the next decade. Things did not go so well at home for John and Margaret, owing to John's alcoholism. They would split up for a number of years, but when John sobered up in the 1830s, they were able to get back together. They would give birth to 2 more children, Margaretta, or Maggie, in 1833, followed by her sister Catherine, or Kate, in 1837. Life for the Fox family could be described as relatively normal. Unfortunately for the children, their father would spend long stretches of time away from home for work. Thus, they would be left to be raised largely in part by their mother. The oldest daughter, Leah, would leave home in 1845, getting married at the age of 14 to a man named Bowman Fish. Leah and Bowman were gifted with a daughter named Lizzie. However, Bowman would not stay to support his family and left Leah and her daughter in abject poverty in 1847. John, Margaret and their children would pack up their belongings and move into a small farmhouse near the town of Hydesville in December of 1847. Not long after moving into this farmhouse, Margaret Fox began to believe that the home was haunted. She had heard stories that a peddler was murdered somewhere on the property, but was unable to discern where exactly this had taken place. This caused her to live her life on the edge, jumping out of her skin at the slightest sound, whether it be banging of household items or the shifting around of the house. Her daughters would use this newfounded fear against her and would begin to play pranks on their mother. The girls quickly figured out that if they dropped things like apples onto the floor, that it would make a sort of hollow knock which would drive their mother crazy. Of course, it was of benefit to Maggie and Kate that their mother would never suspect it was them. Margaretta, when asked about the noises, would say the following: "When we went to bed at night, we used to tie an apple to a string and move the string up and down. This caused the apple to bump on the floor. Other times, we would simply just drop the apple on the floor, and it would make a strange noise every time it would rebound. Mother listened to this for a time. She would not understand it and did not suspect us as being capable of the trick because we were so young." Unfortunately for Margaret, things would get much more real. On the night of March 31st, 1848, Margaret and Kate would be forced to sleep in their parents' room due to their mother panicking at the thought of spiritual devils in their home. The girls, for their part, showed no remorse for how they treated their mother, letting her spiral downward into sleep deprivation and torment. While the family was sleeping, there came a large knock from somewhere in the room. Kate decided that she would attempt to converse with this entity that her and her sister had come to call Mr. Splitfoot, that they had presumed to be a spirit. It should be noted as well that Mr. Splitfoot is also an uncommon moniker for the devil. The first thing she did was ask the spirit to repeat the number of snaps of her fingers. It would oblige, matching her snapping with knocks. The spirit was also able to knock out the ages of the two girls with no effort. Other things they asked the spirit to do was to knock for how many children that were in the family, for which it produced 6 knocks. It was also able to count out 10 knocks when asked to do so. Finally, Kate would ask the spirit if it could continue to perform the knocks if they brought in outsiders, to which it knocked again in agreement. Mrs. Fox would then invite the neighbors into their home, who were equally as shocked as the Fox family that they witnessed the spirit knock out the answers to their questions. They first thought the matter to be purely in jest, and they didn't think that it could be a matter to be taken very seriously. However, they would quickly change their minds because of the convincing expressions that the young girls were able to give. The Fox family was able to figure out a system in which they could move behind simple confirmatory knocks to answering yes or no type questions. 2 knocks for yes and 1 for no. Through this spirit confirmed that it was indeed that of a peddler who had been murdered and buried beneath the home. The believed name of the peddler was Charles Rosna. This, however, has never been able to be proven, and no records of a missing peddler exist by that name. The spirit would also tell them that his killer had since died, so justice could not be done. The family did attempt to dig up the remains of the spirit, however they were unable to produce a body or any kind of remains. Over the course of the next few days, word had begun to spread about the spirit communicating with the family. The Fox sisters would soon become then known as a 9-day wonder, or in modern times, they got their 15 seconds of fame. Newspapers would begin to print headlines on the happenings in the Fox home, which drew larger crowds of onlookers to meet the girls that could speak to the dead. With all of this attention, also came skepticism. There were some in the town who would accuse the Fox sisters of witchcraft and dabbling in the occult. Even the town's minister asked the family to leave the church for fear they truly were talking to ghosts. In order to get the girls out of town and away from the house, John and Margaret decided that the girls would be best split up. Maggie would be sent to stay with their brother David, while Kate was sent to stay with their sister Leah in Rochester. Leah, truly curious as to the whole communication phenomena, asked Kate to tell her the truth about what was going on. Leah would begin to make plans to further push her sisters into the spotlight. Unfortunately for Leah, she was unable to take good care of Kate as she was not very well off, so she would send Kate, followed by Maggie, to live with her friends Amy and Isaac Post. To get an appreciation for who the Posts were, we'll need to examine some of the events of the times. Firstly, the Post family were Quakers in a town that was largely recognized as being free-thinking. An abolitionist newspaper was founded in the town in 1847, and the following year, a convention was held for women's rights. This event was considered one of the founding moments of the women's suffrage movement. Akin to the political happenings, the town was also home to new religious ideologies. One of those were the early foundings of the concept of spiritualism, which was the belief in itself that the human soul would live on even after the death of a person's physical body, and would possess an ability to communicate with those still living, even after death. Maggie and Kate did not buy into the movement itself, or the fact that they were truly communicating with spirits. Leah, with the newfound talents of herself and her sisters, did everything she could to convince them that the spirits were truly real. Kate, still being that she was quite young, easily accepted Leah's explanations, but Maggie, who was still very skeptical and believed that what they were doing was wrong. Nonetheless, Leah's grand plan was for the Fox sisters to bring their gifts and their messages to the public, with her motivating factor being the monetization of these gifts. With Leah selling her sisters' abilities to the Posts, they were certainly eager to see their talents for themselves. After seeing one demonstration from the girls, the Posts were absolutely convinced that their abilities were real. Even their sister Leah was able to convince the Posts that she had abilities as a medium by communicating with the Post's deceased daughter. Because of this, the spectacle had to grow. The Posts rented out Corinthian Hall, the largest hall in Rochester, for an event that was attended by over 400 people on the 14th of November, 1849. In front of the large crowd, the Fox sisters were able to carry out the first ever demonstration of spiritualism through the use of seances before a paying audience. Most in attendance had only went because they believed that the girls could be confirmed as frauds. Unfortunately, those people would be sorely disappointed as the three girls played their parts perfectly, and any inclination that the spirit communication was not real was quickly thrown out the window. Following the event, the girls were brought backstage by Amy Post, disrobed, and examined by all of the skeptics. There, they found no evidence that the talents were a hoax. Not being entirely sold on a first show, a second was done the following night at the request of a local newspaper. For the second night in a row, the girls' performance was flawless. When the girls went on stage for yet a third evening, it was uncovered that someone had smuggled in a barrel of tar, meaning to play a prank on the three Fox sisters. They went on stage to do their performance, and the audience grew on edge. They had no explanation for how these sounds were manifesting within the hall. Thus, some in the crowd would set off fireworks. The Fox sisters had to be taken from the stage and leave through the back of the theater. In 1850, the girls left Rochester and relocated to New York City on invitation of Andrew Jackson Davis, who was an important figurehead and already well established in the spiritualist community. Davis is credited as the one who originally predicted the rise in popularity of spiritualism and generated the initial idea that spirits could make contact with humans even after death. Davis had made this prediction about a year before the rise in stardom of the Fox Sisters. It is a truth that spirits commune with one another while one is in the body and the other is in the higher spheres. All the world will hail with delight the ushering in of that era when the interiors of men will be opened and the spiritual communication will be established. A year following that prediction, on the night the girls first experienced the communication with spirit in their bedroom, Davis wrote the following entry in his diary. About daylight this morning, a warm breathing passed over my face, and I heard a voice, tender and strong, saying, "Brother, the good work has begun. Behold, a living demonstration is born." With Davis's belief in spirit communication, coupled with the girls' talents, he would quickly become recognized as the figurehead of the spiritualist movement. Spiritualism took root in the lives of many Americans who had begun to reject Calvinistic doctrine as it pertained to predestination. The key selling point for spiritualism was that it allowed living people a direct connection with what comes after. The three girls would take their talents to New York City, being quartered at Barnum's Hotel, a hotel that was owned by a cousin of Davis. They would hold regular seances in the parlor of the hotel at 10 a.m., 5 p.m., and 8 p.m. every day. Often, these seances were attended by as many as 30 people who each would pay $1 for admission. The seances would attract the attention of some very notable people in the time, such as Horace Greeley, James Fenimore Cooper, William Cullen Bryant, and William Lloyd Garrison. The success would ignite a traveling tour for the sisters, during which their lives would go in 3 different directions for a number of years. While Leah would remain behind in New York, holding private seances, Maggie and Kate would travel to such places as Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus, St. Louis, Washington, and Philadelphia. Throughout the course of their speaking tour, many new theories would begin to emerge that were skeptical of the girls' abilities. A physician by the name of E.P. Longworthy investigated the sisters. He made note that the knocks only came when the girls' dresses were in contact with the table. He believed that the girls were generating the noises themselves. John Hearn, a columnist for the New York Tribune, would also note the same behavior as Longworthy. The religious community would further delve into the matter. Reverend John Austin was the first to suggest that the noises were made by the cracking of joints in the girls' toes. This method was demonstrated by Reverend Potts to an audience, proving that the theory could be authentic. Many others would come forward, noting that the girls could not produce any rappings or knocks if the sisters were not seated at a table and their feet were not on the floor. Leah would remarry a man named Calvin Brown in 1851, but unfortunately Calvin would pass away only 2 years later. Leah, undeterred by this, would go on to marry another man named Daniel Underhill in 1857 who worked on Wall Street. Daniel was also a proclaimed spiritualist and, paired with his new wife, like Davis, they also became figureheads in that community. It was during their events in Philadelphia in 1852 that things would start to change for the girls. Maggie had attracted the attention of a former U.S. Navy medical officer turned Arctic explorer by the name of Elisha Kent. Kent had recently returned from his first Arctic expedition and was determined, on hearing that the girls were in the city, to expose them as frauds. Kent would attend every single show the girls put on, but he was unable to discern what their secret was. He would arrange to meet with Maggie, whom he found quite attractive. The two had begun courting one another, and this was not well received by those who surrounded both parties. For those spiritualists, they did not want one of their rising stars marrying a non-believer. For Kent, his family were Roman Catholics, so to them the concept of spiritualism amounted to heresy. At the time of their courtship, Maggie was 13 years younger than Kent, and he would continue to encourage her to give up her life of sameness and deceit. She would oblige him and retire her mediumship and seances in favor of getting an education which Kent paid for. In 1853, Kent would set off on his second Arctic expedition, which abruptly ended in 1855. His ship had become locked in the ice, and his company was forced to march across the Arctic for 83 days, finally reaching safety. This expedition and subsequent trek wrought havoc on Kent's health, and he was a mere shadow of the man he once was when he returned to New York City. On his return, the two were married in an intimate, unofficial ceremony. They exchanged rings and vows as witnessed by their friends, but were never legally married. The pair would take a trip to Havana, Cuba in 1857 to try to help Kent regain some of his health, but unfortunately, he passed away sometime during their travels. His final wish was for his wife to convert to Catholicism, which she did. Unfortunately for Maggie, Kent's family did not recognize their marriage, and she was forced to return to her life as a medium, unloved and penniless. Because of that trauma, Maggie unfortunately began to overindulge with alcohol and would spiral downward into a severe case of depression. When Maggie originally departed on her courtship with Kent, Kate was left alone. She ended up being cared for by a man named Horace Greenlee. She would go on to attend a private school in New York, but did not live a happy life. When she was deemed old enough to care for herself, she left Greenlee's home and returned to her life as a medium. Kate would move beyond the simple rappings and noises to a full-blown stage show consisting of manifesting spirits and channeling the dead. She developed an ability to write answers from spirit, while simultaneously speaking messages from another. Kate's star continued to rise, and she became the true definition of a celebrity. Unfortunately, like her sister, Kate would develop her own alcohol problems, compounded by still only being a teenager. Kate would leave the United States in 1871 at the age of 34 and travel to England. Her trip was sponsored by a banker in New York, so she would not have to put her talents to use so quickly when she arrived. Her trip was not viewed as a trip for mediumship alone, but more missionary work for the Church of Spiritualism. She would only hold private seances for notable persons. Kate, too, would find love during her time in England. In 1872, she married a man named Henry Jenkin, who was a barrister in London. Kate and Henry would have 2 sons together. Her first son, Ferdinand, was thought to have mediumship ability by the time he was 3 years old. Maggie would travel to England to visit Kate in 1876. Unfortunately for Kate, her husband would pass away in 1881 from a stroke. By 1885, the concept of spiritualism was in great decline. Skepticism, leading to investigations of fraud, became more frequent. Maggie would be offered a chance to demonstrate her ability to a commission in New York, but was unsuccessful in a test she was described as failing miserably. Kate also traveled back to New York in 1885, but her alcohol problems followed. In 1888, she was arrested for drunkenness and idleness. These events would be the cause of her children being taken from her. Maggie attempted to help Kate by petitioning for custody of the children, but unfortunately was unsuccessful. She was, however, able to secure them a place with one of their uncles in England. It was believed that Leah may have played a part in Kate's arrest and subsequent removal of her children. She would have been concerned with Kate and her sister's alcoholism threatening her livelihood and putting a black mark on her status in the spiritualist community. At this point, Maggie and Kate had reached the end of their rope with Leah. On the 21st of October in 1888, the New York World published an interview it had done with Maggie, of which she charged them $1,500 for the exclusivity rights to interview her. This interview was in anticipation of what was to come. That evening, she would get on stage at the New York Academy of Music and denounce spiritualism. As part of the article, she would describe the Hydesville events as the following. Mrs. Underhill, my eldest sister, took Katie and me to Rochester. There, we discovered a new way to make the raps. My sister Katie was the first to observe that, by swishing her fingers, she could produce certain noises with her knuckles and joints, and that had the same effect that could be heard through her toes. Finding that we could make raps with our feet, first with one foot, then with both, we practiced this until we could do this easily when the room was dark. Like most perplexing things, when made clear, it was astonishing how easily it's done. The rapping is simply the result of perfect control of the muscles of the leg below the knee. These govern the tendons in the foot that allow the action of the toe and ankle bones that are not commonly known. Such perfect control is only possible when the child is taken away at an early age, and certainly and continually taught to practice the muscles, as these grow stiffer in later years. This, then, is the simple explanation of the whole method behind the knocks and the raps. These remarks were not caused by the spiritualist movement, but pure, unadulterated rage at her sister Leah and other prominent members of that community. This was because they had chastised Kate for her alcohol abuse and her reputation for not being able to care for her children. Kate was in the audience for Maggie's speech, and she said the following. My sister Katie and myself were very young children when this horrible deception began. At night, when we went to bed, we used to tie an apple to a string and move the string up and down, causing the apple to bump on the floor. Or we would drop the apple on the floor and it made a strange noise every time it hit. For a great many people, when they hear the rapping, they imagine that once the spirits are touching them, and this is a very common delusion. Some very wealthy people even came to see me some years ago when I lived on 42nd Street, and I did some rappings for them. I would make the spirit rap on the chair, and one of the ladies cried out, "I feel the spirit tapping me on the shoulder." Of course, that was pure imagination. Maggie then got up from her seat, removed a shoe, placed her foot on a wooden stool. The audience was taken aback when they witnessed Maggie making the rapping noise with the joints in her feet. The newspapers would go on to describe her performance with the following headline. There stood a black-robed, sharp-faced widow, working her big toe and solemnly declaring that this was the way she created the excitement that has driven so many persons to suicide or insanity. One moment it was ludicrous, the next it was weird. She would go on to take one final jab at Leah, stating she knew the rappings were manufactured the entire time and exploited her sisters for her own gain. Maggie then thanked God for her ability to expose the movement and exited the stage. The next day, the headlines in the morning newspapers called Maggie's exposition a death blow to spiritualism, and it began to divide the community. Above all, there were some who believed that since she was unable to turn a profit as a medium, that she would become one of its fiercest critics. Those entrenched in the community would dismiss her claims as confessions of a sad, tired drunk. Kate did not join her sister on stage that evening and would later state that she didn't agree with Maggie and would continue to work as a medium until her death. About a year later, In 1891, feeling pressure from the spiritualist community, Maggie would attempt to recant her confession at the behest of her spirit guides. Unfortunately, this would fall on deaf ears and elicit only more malcontent from those devoted to spiritualism. While performing one evening at the Manhattan Liberal Club under the pseudonym Mrs. Spencer, she would reveal many secrets of the mediumship profession. This would go largely unrecognized by many in the community, and this would mark the end of the journey for the Fox sisters. Leah had passed away in 1890, then in her 70s, never repairing her relationship with her sister. Kate would pass away at her home on the 3rd of July in 1892 from kidney disease, effectively drinking herself to death. Maggie would continue in her struggles, failing to reboot her career as a medium and continuing to overindulge with alcohol. She lived out her days in an old tenement house before being taken to the home of Emily Ruggles in Brooklyn. Maggie would pass away only a few short years later, on the 8th of March in 1893, with not a penny to her name. All three sisters are interred in Brooklyn. Maggie and Kate rest together at the Cypress Hills Cemetery, while Leah is with the rest of the Fox family in the Greenwood Cemetery. Two of the greatest critics of the spiritualist movement were the girls at the center of it. For a number of years, Maggie and Kate. Kate's viewpoint was that she regarded spiritualism as one of the greatest curses the world had ever known. As for what Maggie said, I'll leave you with her view on the movement as a whole, which can be summed up from her comments on it from the exposition that day on the 21st of October. I have been chiefly instrumental in perpetrating the fraud of spiritualism upon an all too confiding public. Most of you doubtless know. The greatest sorrow in my life has been that this is true, and though it has come late in my day, I am now prepared to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. I am here tonight as one of the founders of spiritualism to denounce it as an absolute falsehood from the beginning to the end, as the flimsiest of superstitions and the most wicked blasphemy known to the world. If you're hearing this message, that means you made it to the end of this week's story covering the Fox sisters. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, and I'd like to thank you very much for listening. For more information about the podcast, please visit our link tree in the show notes. And remember before you go to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any of our exciting stories to come. If you liked the episode, please tell a friend. And if you would like to donate and show your support for the podcast, donations can be made to our PayPal account in the link tree. And remember to come back next week for a story about the origin of Lucifer and the hierarchy of hell. New episodes are released every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, but for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious agenda. I'll see you again next week.